Do it, king of crows, and the lineage of a failure. The cry tore from the throat of a dying boy, barely 12, his armor shattered like glass against the cobblestones. Leopold stood over him, a titan of black plate and fur, his spear, forged from the meteoric iron of the silent peaks, leveled at the boy's throat. Around them, the murder of crows that lived in the castle rafters went silent, thousands of black eyes watching. The Iron Legion has no room for the weak, Elian. Leopold's voice was a low, seismic rumble. You fell. You die. Wait! The voice was a whip crack. Aveline Thornwald, her noble crest tarnished by the mud of the Omega ranks, stepped between the spear's tip and the boy. She didn't draw her sword. She knelt. The goal here was to immediately establish the power dynamic. Leopold isn't just a king. He's a force of nature, defined by a harsh martial code. By placing Aveline, an Omega, or social pariah, between him and his prey, we create instant friction. The crows serve as a Gothic chorus, reflecting Leopold's internal curse. The castle of ravens did not sit upon the earth. It seemed to have been spat out by it. It was a jagged tooth of obsidian, piercing the gray sky of the Northlands, perpetually wreathed in the soot of 1,000 hearths and the beating wings of Leopold's pets. To the common folk, Leopold was not just a Vua, a king. He was the Carrion Lord. Legend whispered that he had traded his heart for the ability to see through the eyes of every crow in the kingdom, a bargain that had left him immortal, invincible, and utterly devoid of mercy. Aveline Thornwald knew better. She knew that every time a crow fell from the sky, Leopold flinched in the shadows of his throne room. She knew because she had once been the daughter of the High March, a girl of silk and silver before the Thornwald name was stripped of its titles and she was cast into the Omegas, the disposable vanguard of Leopold's army. The day had begun with the smell of ozone and wet iron. The border skirmish with the Highland Raiders had been brief but brutal. Alien, the youngest recruit and the boy Leopold secretly watched with a strange, pained intensity, had missed a parry. The Raiders hadn't killed him, they had broken him, leaving him as a message to the king. Now, in the central courtyard, the air was thick with the scent of impending death. The soldiers of the Iron Legion stood in a perfect, terrifying circle. They were alphas in spirit, men who had never known the touch of a healer because they never allowed themselves to be hit. In their eyes, Elian was a contagion of weakness. Leopold moved with a grace that defied his massive frame. His cape, made of overlapping raven feathers, hissed against the stone. He held the Spear of Ruin, a weapon that had tasted the blood of a dozen usurpers. Aveline, Leopold said, his voice catching the wind. You are out of formation. Return to the mud where you belong. Aveline didn't move. Her blonde hair, chopped short with a combat knife, was matted with sweat. Her own armor was a mismatched collection of leather and rusted steel, the gear of an Omega. But her eyes remained those of a Thornwald, piercing, defiant, and ancient. He is a child, Leopold, she said softly. The raiders broke his legs, not his spirit. If you kill him, you are doing their work for them. I am preserving the strength of this realm, Leopold countered. He stepped forward, the spear point grazing the boy's collarbone. Elian let out a strangled whimper, his eyes blown wide with terror. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If I allow a cub to survive a failure, the pack will rot from within. The crows began to scream then, a cacophony of caws that felt like needles in the brain. It was the sound of the curse, the collective consciousness of the birds demanding the sacrifice. Leopold's hand tightened on the shaft of the spear. His knuckles were white. For a fleeting second, Aveline saw a shadow cross his face, not of anger, but of a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. He was a prisoner of his own legend. You speak of chains, Aveline said, stepping closer, her hand reaching out not for a weapon, but for the boy's matted hair. But you've forgotten what forged them. It wasn't iron, Leopold. It was the heat of the fire. The courtyard went silent. No one spoke to the Vua this way. The Alpha commanders shifted their feet, their hands moving to their sword hilts. They expected a decapitation. They expected the king to sweep the spear through Aveline's throat and the boy's heart in one fluid motion. Instead, Leopold paused. He looked at Aveline, really looked at her, for the first time since her family's fall. He saw the scar across her cheek, the dirt under her fingernails, and the absolute lack of fear in her gaze. She was an Omega by rank, but her soul was something he hadn't encountered in centuries. In this chapter, we establish the atmospheric weight. I wanted the castle to feel alive and oppressive. The Omega label is used here to signify Aveline's fall from grace, contrasting her noble spirit with her lowly position. Leopold is introduced as a man trapped by his own ideology, a king who believes he must be a monster to be a protector. The tension in the courtyard was a living thing, a coiled viper ready to strike. The spear of ruin hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth of everyone present. It was a weapon that hungered for finality. Elian, the cub, was fading. His breath came in shallow, ragged hitches. Blood pooled beneath his shattered knees, staining the gray cobblestones a dark, visceral crimson. He looked up at Leopold, seeking a father's mercy and finding only a judge's steel. "Finish it," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to be an Omega." The word Omega hit Aveline like a physical blow. She saw the shame in the boy's eyes, the same shame she had carried when they stripped the thorn-walled signet from her finger. "You are not a burden, Elian," Aveline said. Her voice was no longer a shout. It was a lullaby, incongruous and jarring against the backdrop of war-hardened men. She leaned down further. The spear of ruin was inches from her temple now. Leopold's breath was cold, smelling of mountain air and old parchment. He didn't pull back. He watched, his eyes like two burning coals in the shadow of his helm. "Aveline," he warned, a rumble of thunder, "do not interfere with the transition." "Watch me, Vua," she whispered. Aveline ignored the spear. She ignored the thousands of crows that had descended from the ramparts to coat the surrounding walls in a carpet of black feathers. She reached out and took Elian's head in her hands. Her touch was impossibly gentle. With a thumb, she wiped a smear of soot from his forehead. Then she leaned forward. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. Even the crows ceased their fidgeting. Aveline Thornwald, the disgraced warrior, the girl who had been told she was nothing but meat for the front lines, pressed her lips to the boy's cold, sweating forehead. It wasn't a kiss of romance, nor even of simple pity. It was an act of profound, sacred recognition. It was the Omega claiming the dying, declaring that even in the dirt, there is a kingdom. The spear of ruin wobbled. Leopold's grip, usually as steady as the mountain roots, faltered. A single tear, not of water, but of the dark, cursed ichor that ran through his veins, trailed down the inside of his visor. The spear, the symbol of his absolute unyielding will, didn't just lower. It dropped. The heavy iron point struck the stone with a dull clack, ringing out through the silent courtyard. The Alpha dropped his spear. A collective gasp rippled through the Iron Legion. The commanders looked at each other in horror. The king had shown hesitation. The king had allowed a moment of softness to break the iron law. Leopold stood there, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He looked down at his empty hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The crows above erupted into a frantic, panicked flight, a whirlwind of black that blotted out the sun. "Aveline," Leopold whispered so low only she could hear. "What have you done?" "I reminded you that you are still a man," she replied, looking up at him while still cradling the boy. "And that this boy is still your son." The revelation hung in the air, a fragment of backstory finally breaking the surface. The cub wasn't just a recruit. He was the secret heir, the illegitimate fruit of a time before the curse took hold of Leopold's heart. Leopold's shoulders slumped. The terrifying Alpha, the crow's king, looked suddenly small against the backdrop of his own fortress. He reached up and slowly unlatched his helm. revealing a face that was strikingly handsome, but etched with centuries of sorrow. His skin was pale, mapped with faint, black veins that pulsed in time with the beating wings above. "Take him to the inner sanctum," Leopold commanded, his voice shaking. "Call the weavers. If he dies, the crows will take us all." He turned his back on the legion, on the laws, and on the shocked faces of his men. He walked toward the shadows of the great hall, leaving his spear lying in the mud. The unpredictable twist here is twofold. The physical act of the kiss breaking the king's resolve, and the revelation of Elian's parentage. I use the spear dropping as a physical manifestation of Leopold's crumbling mental state. The contrast between Aveline's Omega status and her Alpha level of moral courage is the engine of this chapter. When the Omega girl kissed the dying cub's forehead, the Alpha dropped his spear. The inner sanctum of the Castle of Ravens was a place of stifling silence and the rhythmic, unsettling sound of needles clicking. It was here that the weavers resided, blind, ageless women who spun not wool, but the very essence of the kingdom's vitality to mend the broken. Elian lay upon a slab of cold white marble, his breath a faint mist in the freezing air. His legs were a ruin of bone and muscle, but it was his eyes that troubled Aveline the most. They were fixed on the vaulted ceiling, reflecting the flickering torchlight with a hollow, silver sheen. "He is fading," one of the weavers whispered, her fingers dancing over a loom that held a single, shimmering thread of gold. "The king's spear did not take him, but the king's shadow is cold. The boy has no warmth left to hold on to." Aveline stood at the foot of the slab, her arms crossed. Her Omega leathers felt heavy, soaked with the boy's blood and the persistent drizzle of the Northlands. She was out of place in this sacred space, an intruder in a world of alphas and sorcery. "Then give him mine," Aveline said, her voice echoing. The weavers stopped. Their sightless eyes turned toward her in unison. Behind her, in the doorway, a shadow loomed. Leopold had entered, his face still bare, his dark hair falling over a brow that looked as though it had been carved from the mountain itself. "You have nothing left to give, Aveline Thornwald," Leopold said, his voice a ghost of its former power. "The Thornwalds were stripped of their light a decade ago. You are an Omega. You are the absence of warmth." Aveline turned, her jaw set. "Is that what you tell yourself to justify what you've become? That anyone below your rank is an empty vessel?" She stepped toward him, ignoring the way the crows in the high rafters shifted and hissed. "I kissed that boy's forehead and you dropped your spear. Don't tell me I have nothing. I have the one thing you traded away to those birds." Leopold flinched, the black veins on his neck pulsed, turning almost violet. "You know nothing of the bargain. You were a child when your father tried to save me. Look where it got him. Look where it got you." The fragment of the past hung between them. Aveline's father, the former High March, had been Leopold's closest confidant. He had seen the curse taking root, the way the crows began to follow Leopold, the way his heartbeat slowed to a glacial thrum. He had tried to break the bond with a ritual of ancient fire, and for his treason, his lands were salted and his daughter was cast into the lowest pits of the military. "My father died trying to keep you human," Aveline said softly. "And today, I did more for your son with a single gesture than you have done with all your iron laws." Outside the sanctum, a low, rhythmic thumping began. It was the sound of spear butts hitting stone. The Iron Legion was assembling in the Great Hall. They weren't waiting for orders. They were demanding an explanation. To an alpha, a king who drops his weapon is a king who is already dead. Leopold looked at Elian, then at Aveline. For a second, the mask of the Vua slipped, and she saw the man her father had loved like a brother. He looked terrified. "Draven will not let this pass," Leopold whispered. "He is the first alpha. He sees Elian as a defect. He sees you as a contagion, and now he sees me as a failure." "Then let him see," Aveline replied, her hand moving to the hilt of her rusted short sword. "The Legion follows strength. Let's show them a different kind." This chapter builds the internal logic of the world. I wanted to contrast the weavers, spiritual/healing, with the iron legend, martial/harsh. The dialogue reveals that Aveline's fall wasn't just bad luck. It was a consequence of her father's love for Leopold. The tension shifts from "will the boy live" to "will the king survive his own men?" The night brought no rest. The castle of Ravens seemed to exhale a cold, damp mist that clung to the tapestries and dampened the torches. Leopold stood on the balcony of the sanctum, looking out over the black lake that bordered the fortress. The water was as still as glass, reflecting the thousands of crows perched on the battlements like gargoyles. Aveline joined him, her step silent. She had cleaned the blood from her hands, but the scent of iron remained. "Why did you do it?" Leopold asked, not looking at her. "The boy was a lost cause. The law was clear. By intervening, you've signed your own death warrant. Draven will challenge you to the trial of thorns by sunrise." Aveline leaned against the cold stone railing. "I didn't do it for the law, Leopold. I did it because when I looked at him, I saw you. Not the Vua who hides behind a murder of crows, but the boy who used to skip stones on this very lake before the crown became a cage." Leopold closed his eyes. The crows above let out a collective, mournful cry. "The cage is necessary. Do you know why I made the bargain? The Highland raiders were at the gates. My father was dead. The kingdom was burning. I asked the mountain for the power to protect my people. The mountain sent the crows." He turned to her, and she saw the true horror of the curse. His eyes weren't just dark, they were shifting, the pupils expanding and contracting like a bird's. "Every crow you see is a piece of my soul, Aveline. I see what they see. I feel their hunger, their cold, their deaths. When a crow dies, a part of my mind screams. To keep the kingdom safe, I have to keep the murder strong. And strength requires the culling of the weak." "But Elian is your blood," Aveline countered, her voice rising. "You think the mountain wants his life? Or does it just want your misery?" "It wants the lineage," Leopold said. "If the heir is weak, the murder disperses. The protection vanishes. The raiders return. I am not killing a boy. I am preserving a shield." "You're preserving a cemetery," Aveline snapped. She reached out and grabbed his hand. His skin was unnaturally cold, but as her fingers laced through his, a jolt went through them both. The crows on the rampart suddenly took flight, a chaotic explosion of wings. Leopold gasped, his knees buckling. Aveline held him upright, her warmth clashing with his supernatural chill. "What is this?" Leopold gasped, staring at their joined hands. The black veins on his arm were receding, turning back to the healthy hue of a living man where she touched him. "It's the thorn-walled blood," Aveline realized, her heart hammering. "My father didn't fail, Leopold. He just didn't finish. The fire wasn't in a ritual, it was in us." In that moment of clarity, the doors to the balcony burst open. General Draven stood there, flanked by 4 Alpha guards. His armor was polished to a mirror finish, his face a mask of disgusted stone. "Vua," Draven said, his voice like grinding gravel. "The Legion has voted. We do not serve a king who holds the hand of an Omega while his kingdom withers. Elian will be released from his suffering tonight. And the girl, she will be fed to the pits." Leopold straightened, his hand still anchored to Aveline's. The darkness returned to his eyes, but it was different now, controlled. "You forget yourself, Draven. I am the Vua." "You were the Vua," Draven corrected, drawing a massive broadsword. "Now you are just a man who dropped his spear. And in the Iron Legion, that is the only sin that cannot be forgiven. Here, I've introduced the supernatural mechanics of the curse and the antidote." Aveline's touch, representing warmth versus the cold of the curse, is a classic but effective trope for emotional tension. Draven's entrance serves as the inciting incident for the second half of the story, moving the conflict from internal to external. The great hall of the Castle of Ravens was a cavernous space, designed to make men feel small and the king feel like a god. Tonight, however, the proportions felt skewed. Leopold sat upon the obsidian throne, but he did not wear his helm. Beside him stood Aveline, her hand resting on the hilt of a sword she had borrowed from the sanctum's armory. Opposite them, 200 alphas stood in perfect, silent rows. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, oil, and unspoken mutiny. Draven stepped forward into the circle of light cast by the central fire pit. He didn't bow. "Uah," Draven began, his voice echoing. "The Iron Legion exists because we are the apex. We are the spear that does not break, the shield that does not crack. Today, in the courtyard, we saw a crack. We saw a king's hand shake because of a sentiment. Sentiment is a luxury for the dead." Leopold leaned forward, the raven feather cloak rustling. "You speak of sentiment, Draven. I speak of legacy. Alien is the future of this house." "The future cannot be built on broken legs," Draven roared, slamming his fist against his breastplate. The sound was like a hammer on an anvil. "If the boy lives, the Legion sees that failure is tolerated. If the girl lives, they see that the hierarchy is a lie. We demand the trial of thorns. Let the Omega prove her fire against the iron of the first Alpha." Aveline felt a cold sweat prickle her neck. The trial of thorns was a death sentence. The challenger had to fight through a corridor of alphas, each allowed one strike before reaching the general. No Omega had ever survived the first 10 steps. "I accept," Aveline said before Leopold could speak. The king turned to her, his eyes wide. "Aveline, no, you don't know what they do." "I know exactly what they do," she said, looking past Leopold to the rows of men she had served alongside in the mud. "They think strength is the absence of pain. They think being an alpha means you never bleed. But I've bled every day for 10 years. I've lived in the dirt you're all afraid to touch." She stepped down from the dais, walking toward Draven. She was half his size, her equipment a joke compared to his masterwork plate. But she walked with a grace that made the soldiers in the front row hesitate. "You want to see a crack, Draven?" Aveline asked, stopping an arm's length from him. "I'll show you a canyon." She turned back to Leopold. "Keep the boy alive. That is your only job. No matter what happens in this hall, do not let the Weavers stop. If Elion dies, the murder wins. If he lives, we all win." Leopold looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who was about to lose everything for the second time in his life. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but he didn't touch her. The crows above were screaming now, a deafening sound that shook the very foundations of the castle. They sensed the discord. They sensed the blood. "The trial begins at midnight," Draven declared, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Prepare yourself, Omega. By the time the moon hits the Black Lake, you will be nothing but a memory in the soot." As the alphas filed out of the hall, the silence that replaced them was even more terrifying. Aveline stood alone in the center of the room, the weight of 1,000 years of tradition pressing down on her shoulders. In the shadows of the rafters, a single white crow, an anomaly, a freak of nature, landed on the arm of the obsidian throne. It didn't scream. It just watched Aveline with eyes that looked surprisingly like Elion's. The first twist was the spear. The second was the blood. The third, Aveline realized, was that the crows weren't Leopold's pets. They were his jailers. And the only way to kill a jailer was to burn the prison down. This chapter sets the high stakes for the climax. The Trial of Thorns provides a clear physical goal and obstacle. I introduced the white crow as a symbol of hope and a supernatural wild card. The shift in Aveline's motivation, from saving a boy to breaking a system, prepares the reader for the final chapters. When the Omega girl kissed the dying cub's forehead, the Alpha dropped his spear. Chapter 6. The Gauntlet of the Discarded. Midnight in the Castle of Ravens did not bring darkness. It brought a bruising, purple twilight reflected off the snow-capped peaks. The great hall had been cleared of its tables. In their place, 2 parallel lines of Alpha warriors formed a narrow corridor leading toward General Draven, who sat at the far end on a chair of interlocking shields. This was the Trial of Thorns. Aveline stood at the entrance of the gauntlet. She wore no helmet. Her only protection was the memory of a dying boy's forehead against her lips. The rules are ancient, Draven shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone. The Omega must walk the path. Each Alpha is permitted one strike. She may defend, but she may not strike back until she reaches the first Alpha. If she falls, she is trampled. If she reaches me, she earns the right to die by my hand. Leopold stood on the high balcony, his hands gripping the railing so hard, the stone began to crack. He was forbidden from interfering. To do so would trigger a full-scale civil war within the Legion. Aveline took her first step. The first Alpha, a man she had once shared a ration of bread with, didn't hesitate. He swung a heavy mace. Aveline dived, the wind of the weapon whistling past her ear. She rolled, coming up on one knee, only to face the second warrior. A shield edge caught her in the ribs, a sickening crunch echoing through the hall. She didn't scream. She didn't even grunt. "Is that all?" she whispered, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floor. "I've had worse from the Highland weather." She took another step. Then another duel. The gauntlet was a symphony of violence. Aveline was a blur of movement, dodging, parrying with her rusted short sword, using the momentum of her attackers against them. But for every strike she evaded, two more landed. Her leather armor was shredded. Her shoulder was a mess of bruised purple and angry red. The Alphas began to murmur. By the 20th step, any other warrior, even an Alpha, would have been unconscious. But Aveline Thornwald moved with a terrifying rhythmic persistence. She wasn't fighting like a soldier. She was enduring like a mountain. "Why won't you stay down?" the 10th Alpha hissed, his spear point nicking her thigh. "Because I'm an Omega," Aveline gasped, her lungs burning. "We don't have the luxury of falling. We are the foundation. When the Alphas break, we are the ones who hold the world up." High above, Leopold watched as the murder of crows began to swarm inside the hall. They weren't circling Aveline. They were circling him. They sensed his empathy, his connection to the girl below. The black veins on his neck began to writhe like living snakes. The curse was punishing him for her resilience. Every time Aveline was hit, Leopold felt a phantom pain in the same spot. He was no longer just a spectator. Through the bond of the crows, he was sharing the trial. Aveline reached the halfway point. Her left arm hung limp at her side, useless. Her face was a mask of blood and grit. But her eyes, those piercing Thornwald eyes, never left Draven's face. The general's smirk began to fade. He saw what the others didn't. Aveline wasn't just surviving the strikes. She was absorbing the iron of the Legion. With every blow, the air around her seemed to grow warmer. The frost on the nearby pillars began to melt. She wasn't breaking. She was igniting. This chapter is designed to showcase the physicality of resilience. I wanted to redefine what Omega means, not as a sign of weakness, but as a capacity for endurance that the Alphas, who rely on dominance, lack. The shared pain between Leopold and Aveline further cements their supernatural and emotional bond. While the great hall bled, the inner sanctum was dying. Elian's skin had turned the color of old parchment. The weavers were chanting now, a low, dissonant hum that vibrated in the floorboards. The single gold thread on the loom was fraying, snapping strand by tiny strand. Suddenly, the windows of the sanctum shattered inward. Thousands of crows poured into the room, a literal tide of black feathers and sharp beaks. They didn't attack the weavers. They swarmed the boy. They were reclaiming the alpha essence Leopold had tried to save. "The king's bargain!" the eldest weaver shrieked, shielding her eyes. "The mountain demands the debt. The air is the interest." Leopold, feeling the assault through his mental link, collapsed on the balcony of the great hall. He clutched his head, his screams drowned out by the roar of the crows. Down in the gauntlet, Aveline stopped. She was only 10 paces from Draven. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden, soul-piercing cold that meant Elian was slipping away. "Leopold!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The boy. Focus on the boy." Draven stood up, his massive broadsword glowing in the firelight. "The boy's dead, Omega, and the king is a hollow shell. There is only the Legion now." He didn't wait for her to finish the gauntlet. He violated the rules of his own trial and charged. Aveline, exhausted and broken, barely managed to bring up her rusted sword. The impact of Draven's strike sent her flying backward, her body slamming into the obsidian throne. The stone cracked upon impact. Leopold looked down from the balcony. His eyes were no longer bird-like. They were streaming with dark ichor. He saw Aveline crumpled at the base of his throne. He saw Draven, the man who represented his own worst impulses, standing over her. And then he saw the white crow. The anomaly landed on Aveline's chest. It didn't peck. It leaned down and pressed its beak against the blood-soaked fabric over her heart. Aveline's eyes snapped open. They weren't blue anymore. They were the color of a furnace. "The fire," Leopold whispered, his voice returning. "The Thornwald fire isn't a ritual. It's a choice." He stood up, tearing the raven feather cloak from his shoulders. As the cloak fell, the crows in the hall let out a collective shriek of agony. Leopold wasn't just discarding a garment, he was ripping a piece of his own soul away. "Draven." Leopold's voice was the roar of a collapsing glacier. "Step away from her." The general paused, his sword mid-swing. He looked up at his king, then back at Aveline. He laughed, a harsh, metallic sound. "You have no power here, Leopold. The crows have abandoned you. You are just a man with a broken son and a dead whore." The word whore was the final spark. Aveline didn't use her sword. She grabbed Draven's ankle with her good hand. Where she touched him, the masterwork plate armor didn't just heat up, it melted. Draven screamed as the liquid metal seared his flesh. The Omega wasn't just warm, she was incandescent. The supernatural climax begins here. I wanted to link the trial with the sanctum to show that the physical and spiritual battles are one and the same. The white crow serves as a catalyst, representing the pure, uncorrupted part of the curse that recognizes Aveline's sacrifice. The Thornwald fire is finally defined as the power of choice over fate. The great hall became a furnace. The heat radiating from Aveline was so intense that the alphas in the front rows had to retreat, their own armor becoming uncomfortably hot. Draven kicked himself free, his boot a charred ruin. He looked at Aveline with a mixture of terror and obsessive rage. "Witchcraft, this is the taint of the Omegas." "No," Aveline said, standing up. Her broken arm cracked back into place, the bone mending in a glow of golden light. "This is what happens when you spend 10 years trying to burn someone to ash, Draven. Eventually, you just teach them how to flame." She stepped forward. With every footprint, the obsidian floor glowed cherry red. Draven swung his broadsword in a desperate arc. Aveline caught the blade with her bare hand. The steel turned orange, then white, then shattered into 1,000 molten shards. She didn't strike him. She simply walked into his space and placed her palm on his chest, right over the emblem of the Iron Legion. "You speak of alphas and omegas," she said, her voice calm and terrifying. "But you forgot the most important lesson of the pack. The alpha protects, the omega survives. Without both, there is no pack. There is only a cage." The heat surged. Draven's breastplate turned into a liquid flow, the metal pouring off him like water. He collapsed to his knees, his pride literally melting away. He wasn't dead, but he was broken, his symbol of status destroyed by the very person he had deemed worthless. High above, Leopold felt the curse shattering. The black veins on his skin began to boil away, replaced by the scars of a human man. The crows in the hall and in the sanctum disintegrated into puffs of harmless gray soot. The bargain was over. The debt had been paid not with a life, but with a transformation. Aveline turned away from the cowering general. The fire in her eyes began to dim, returning to the soft, determined blue of the girl who had kissed a cub's forehead. She looked up at the balcony. "Leopold!" The king didn't use the stairs. He leapt from the balcony, his boots hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He ran to her, but he didn't stop. He ran past her, toward the inner sanctum. Aveline followed, her strength flagging now that the fire had done its work. They burst into the sanctum. The weavers were gone, their looms turned to dust. The room was silent. Elian lay on the marble slab. He wasn't moving. Leopold fell to his knees beside the boy. He reached out with hands that were finally warm, finally human. He touched Elian's cheek. "Elian," he whispered, "my son, please." Silence. The heart of the castle seemed to stop beating. Then, a small, ragged breath. Elian's eyes fluttered open. They weren't silver anymore. They were dark brown, clear and full of life. He looked at Leopold, then at Aveline standing in the doorway. "Father," the boy whispered. Leopold didn't answer with words. He pulled the boy into his arms and wept. Not the black ichor of a cursed vua, but the salt tears of a father who had been given a second chance. Aveline leaned against the doorframe, her body finally giving out. She slid down to the floor, a tired smile on her blood-streaked face. The Alpha had dropped his spear. The Omega had found her fire, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the crows were silent. This is the moral resonance of the story. The defeat of Draven isn't through a sword fight, but through the literal melting of his iron ideology. Leopold's humanity is restored through his connection to Aveline and his son. The white crow, disappearing into soot, signifies the end of the supernatural era and the beginning of a human one, when the Omega girl kissed the dying cub's forehead. The Alpha dropped his spear. The morning did not arrive with the usual oppressive gray. For the first time in 3 centuries, the sun clawed its way over the silent peaks, casting long, amber fingers across the black lake. The soot that had perpetually blanketed the castle of ravens was gone, replaced by a light dusting of morning frost that sparkled like diamonds on the obsidian walls. Leopold stood at the center of the courtyard, the very spot where he had almost ended Elian's life 48 hours prior. He was no longer wearing his black plate. He wore a simple tunic of gray wool, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that were scarred, but free of the pulsating black ink of the curse. The spear of ruin still lay where it had fallen, its iron tip half buried in the mud and melted stone. Beside him stood Aveline. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak of thorn-walled blue, her family's crest, a silver briar, visible once more. Her face was still bruised, and her left arm was in a sling, but the radiant warmth she emitted was palpable. She wasn't an Omega anymore, nor was she an Alpha. She was simply Aveline. The Iron Legion was gathered, but the formation was broken. Men stood in small groups, talking in low voices. The terrifying rigidity that had defined them was replaced by a wary, hopeful confusion. "The trial is over," Leopold announced, his voice carrying clearly, without the supernatural reverb of the murder. "The iron laws are struck from the stone. Strength will no longer be measured by what we can destroy, but by what we are willing to protect." He looked toward the gatehouse. Draven was being led out by 2 guards. The former general was a shadow of himself, his armor gone, his chest wrapped in bandages where Aveline's heat had branded him. He didn't look at the king. He looked at the ground, a man whose entire world view had evaporated. "Draven," Leopold said. The general stopped. "You were right about one thing. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But you were wrong about which link was weak. It wasn't the boy. It wasn't the girl. It was the fear in our own hearts that kept us bound to those birds." Draven said nothing. He was marched out of the gates, banished not by a decree of death, but by the simple fact that he no longer belonged in a kingdom that valued mercy. Leopold turned to Aveline. "The mountain is silent. The raiders will hear of this. They will think we are vulnerable." "Let them," Aveline replied, looking up at the high ramparts where Elian stood, watching them with a bright, healthy gaze. "They'll find a kingdom that fights for its children, not for its shadows. That is a much harder wall to climb." Leopold reached down and finally picked up the spear of ruin. He didn't brandish it. He walked to the edge of the black lake and, with a heave that spoke of a man finally at peace, hurled the weapon into the depths. The water swallowed it with a single, silver splash. "The Alpha has no need for a spear," Leopold whispered, "when the Omega has already won the war." He reached out and took Aveline's hand. This time the touch didn't trigger a surge of magic or a scream of crows. It was just skin on skin, a quiet promise between two survivors who had found a way to bridge the gap between the dirt and the throne. The story of the Omega, a girl who kissed a dying cub's forehead, would become a legend, whispered by hearth fires for generations. It was the day the fire returned to the Northlands, not the fire of war, but the fire of a kiss that was strong enough to make a king drop his spear. This final chapter serves as the emotional resolution. The visual of the sun rising and the soot disappearing symbolizes the lifting of the curse. I wanted to end on the image of the spear being thrown into the lake, a literal disposal of the old, violent ways. The partnership between Leopold and Aveline is now one of equals, proving that the social hierarchy was the true curse all along. This story was a journey through the darkest corners of a medieval heart, exploring the tension between duty and humanity. Aveline Thornwald represents the quiet strength of the marginalized, while Leopold shows that even the most powerful leaders are often prisoners of their own legends. Through the act of a simple, selfless kiss, the entire foundation of a martial society was shaken, proving that empathy is the ultimate alpha trait. Thank you for following the saga of Leopold and Aveline. If you felt the tension of the Trial of Thorns and the warmth of the Thornwald fire, please consider sharing this story with others. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic tales of drama, suspense, and emotional redemption.